The clip ID field is going to be referencing database IDs, so we'll need to create a database ID type first before we're able to implement the clip ID. We're going to create the database ID type within the data module within our project. So if we scroll up here to our data module and double click on the mod.rs within. For this particular module, we're going to be using the derive more crate. We're going to utilize the display macro and from macro. We'll also be using our handy deserialize and serialize. We'll also be using the UUID structure from the UUID crate. And we'll also use fromster from the standard library. So this database ID type will be used for all database entities that need an ID. So I'll make it public, and we'll just call it Dbld. That's short for database ID. It's going to have a UUID within, which is essentially just a string of random numbers. We're going to be deriving clone, debug, from, display, deserialize, and serialize for this particular structure. The display derive will allow us to use the dbid in context with println. We won't need to use the debug token. We can just use the standard curly brace token. And from will allow us to convert from a UUID directly into a dbid. Deserialize and serialize are used for converting it to JSON or any other conversions we need to do where it needs to get serialized. For our implementation, we're going to have two functions. First, we'll make a new function. Then we'll have a dbid. And what we'll do is we'll use the UUID structure and call the new v4 function, and then use into to convert it into a dbid type. So remember, we have into implemented already with from, so we can just use .into to create a dbid. We're also going to create a nil function, and that'll also return a dbid. And we'll just make a new dbid, and it'll be a UUID, and we'll just call the nil function for that. All we're doing is forwarding this nil function. What the nil function does is creates a UUID that's all zeros. So this UUID would represent basically an invalid or non-existent UUID. The reason that we would want to use this is because the database ID is internal to the application. However, we are able to serialize that and send it across the wire in a web application. And when that happens, we want to ensure that the database ID is blocked out by using nil. So whatever the database ID happens to be, it's just going to get changed to all zeros, since the client shouldn't know about that ID, and they should not be able to change it if they try to send a new one over the wire. We're also going to be implementing default. And we'll just call self new to create a brand new UUID. And the last thing we'll need is fromster. The error, if the UUID fails to parse, is the error type within the UUID crate. So we'll just do fromster. And then we'll just take a dbid. We'll use the UUID parse stir function as part of the UUID crate. And we'll just use a question mark operator to automatically convert it into the proper error type. The error type that we'll convert into, in this case, will be our clip error. And that's because we have our clip here in our module. We have the ID parse error here. So the UUID error will be converted into a clip error, ID error, if the UUID is invalid. Now that we have a database ID type to work with, we can implement the clip ID field. So if we check our file listing, if we scroll down to clip ID under our field module, we can double click that and begin working. As usual, we'll use serialize and deserialize. We're also going to use the dbid type that we just created, and that can be accessed from the data module from the crate root. We'll also be utilizing derive more. We'll just be using the constructor macro. We'll create our structure. It's going to be called clipid, and that will wrap a database ID. We'll need to derive clone, debug, constructor, deserialize, and serialize. For our implementation, we will have an into inner function. And this will be utilized when we try to convert the clip ID back into a database ID that can be inserted into the database. We'll also want to implement from. So if we get a Dbld, we just want to be able to automatically convert it easily into a clip ID. The last thing we'll want to implement is default. So in this default, we're not actually going to return a new clip ID. We're going to return an empty clip ID. This will be used later when we obscure the database ID from any clients. This all makes sense once we go to actually utilize this function. That way we don't expose any internal data. Now that we've implemented the clip ID field, all of our fields for our clip structure are completed.